of 1943, in a Bavarian mansion transformed into a clinic under SS supervision, a blonde woman gives birth to a child. She will not see her son, she will not know who the father is, and she will never meet him again. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of the official Third Reich program, Lebensborn, founded by Heinrich Himmler. This was not simply a center to help single mothers. It was an experiment in human engineering, designed to create a new racial elite. Under medical cover, systematic rapes, kidnapping of infants, biological experiments, and personality reprogramming were carried out. Thousands of women were used as vessels. Hundreds of thousands of children were separated from their families, renamed, Germanized, and transformed into parts of an unprecedented ideological machine. To what extent did the Lebensborn project truly go? Today, we will examine the devilish events that occurred within the sinister Lebensborn program, the factory of pure blood, as the Third Reich tried to re-engineer humanity. In the early years of the Nazi regime, while Germany rebuilt its military and economic power, an unprecedented biological project was silently taking root, the Lebensborn program. Its name means source of life. It was officially established on December 12, 1935, under the personal leadership of Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS. This initiative represented the institutional embodiment of a racial obsession that placed biology above law and blood above all human considerations. Lebensborn arose in response to a specific demographic problem: the decline in birth rates in Germany following the First World War. The Reichsführer, with his previous experience as a poultry breeder, transferred the principles of genetic selection to the human sphere: selective reproduction, the elimination of undesirable characteristics, and the multiplication of traits considered superior. Although the program was publicly presented as a social assistance organization for single mothers, Lebensborn's true purpose was to create a system of controlled reproduction to preserve what Nazi ideologues defined as pure Aryan blood. The theoretical foundation of the program rested on 19th century European racial theories, which classified humanity into hierarchical categories. On this imaginary scale, the so-called Nordic race, characterized by fair skin, blue eyes, and light hair, occupied the highest position. The Nazi regime elevated this taxonomy to a guiding principle of state policy. In German schools, these ideas were taught as indisputable scientific facts. The average citizen had to prove their Aryan purity with genealogical certificates called an Ahne Pass, literally, ancestor's passport, which documented their lineage up to 1800. To join the SS, the elite corps on which Lebensborn depended, the racial requirements were even stricter, including medical examinations and detailed phenotypic assessments. The transformation of motherhood into a patriotic duty became another fundamental pillar of the program. The regime instituted the Honor Cross of the German Mother in 1938, awarded to women based on the number of their children: bronze for 4 or 5, silver for 6 or 7, and gold for 8 or more. These mothers received material privileges and recognition as biological heroines of the Reich. Propaganda constantly disseminated images of light-haired mothers surrounded by healthy children, while simultaneously eliminating the image of the professional or independent woman. The institutional structure of the program reflected the obsession with control and hierarchy characteristic of the Nazi regime. Every aspect of the reproductive process was under state surveillance, from the selection of candidates and fertilization to birth and early education. Human life, from the moment of its conception, became property of the Reich, and the female body a territory subject to management by the National Socialist State. The Lebensborn concept did not arise in a vacuum. Since 1933, with the passage of the law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases, the Nazi regime had carried out forced sterilization, affecting more than 400,000 people. These were individuals considered genetically inferior, people with physical or mental disabilities, the chronically ill, alcoholics, and people classified as antisocial. This negative side of Nazi eugenics, preventing the multiplication of the undesirable, found its positive complement in Lebensborn, encouraging the multiplication of the desirable. Rudolf Brandt, Himmler's private secretary and one of the program's administrative architects, recorded a fundamentally instrumental attitude toward the participants in internal memorandums. In a document dated March 1936, he wrote, "Motherhood of valuable blood is not a private matter for mothers, but a duty to the state and a guarantee of the nation's eternity." This text, later found by researchers, illustrates how the rhetoric of maternal honor concealed a deeply dehumanized attitude toward women. Lebensborn functioned as a specialized department within the complex Nazi racial apparatus. While the Ahnenerbe, the Society for Research and Education on German Ancestry, provided the pseudoscientific justification, and the Russia, the SS Main Race and Settlement Office, implemented the racial classification policies, Lebensborn focused specifically on the production of human resources. This racial mechanism operated with the bureaucratic precision characteristic of the Third Reich. Every form, every medical assessment, every decision about motherhood was documented with meticulous administrative coldness. The program had diversified funding, which testified to its strategic importance. Although it was formally presented as an associative organization, the Eingetragene Verein, a registered association, it received direct funds from the SS. Economic contributions came from all SS officers, who were required to pay mandatory monthly dues according to their rank. Corporate donations were provided by companies seeking political favor, alongside hidden state subsidies. This financial structure guaranteed operational autonomy and confidentiality regarding its real activities. The implementation of Lebensborn marked a significant milestone in the history of modern biopolitics. For the first time, a developed state systematically tried to control not only who could reproduce, but how, when, and for what specific purpose. This fusion of demographic policy, racial ideology, and reproductive control created troubling precedents that transcended the military defeat of Nazism. The wombs of the Reich in Lebensborn's secret clinics. The Lebensborn houses, strategically located throughout Germany and later across occupied Europe, represented an architectural embodiment of Nazi racial ideology. From the outside, they might look like private clinics or converted mansions, typically situated in idyllic rural areas, away from prying eyes. The first of these institutions opened in 1936 in Steinhöring, Bavaria. By 1944, there were at least 30 houses operating in Germany and the occupied territories, functioning mainly in former mansions, castles, or adapted sanatoriums. Admission to a Lebensborn house was restricted to women who passed a strict selection process. The first filter was genealogical. The candidate had to prove her pure Aryan descent up to at least 1800, presenting a complete anapass. Officials from the Russia, the SS Race and Settlement Office, studied these family trees, discarding any candidacies with Jewish, Slavic, or non-European ancestors. Once this requirement was met, meticulous medical and physical examinations followed. The woman had to be free of hereditary diseases or racial defects. Facial symmetry, skull shape, and overall body structure were evaluated, with a preference for light-haired and blue-eyed women. Finally, the candidate's political and moral profile was analyzed. Her membership in National Socialist organizations and her reputation were assessed. The male participants, mainly SS officers, also underwent similar filters. Himmler had established that every member of the organization must prove racial purity through genealogical documents, physical tests, and behavioral evaluations. The masculine ideal included tall stature, an athletic build, Nordic features, and absolute ideological devotion. In many cases, the pregnancies resulted from planned encounters between selected women and SS officers. These acts, which corresponded to reproductive planning, were carried out according to eugenic calendars, with medical interventions to ensure optimal fertilization conditions. The participants often maintained anonymity, treating the act of intercourse as a patriotic service. After conception, the women entered the Lebensborn houses for constant medical surveillance. Medical teams monitored every aspect of the pregnancy: weight, blood pressure, fetal development, and psychological state. The pregnant women remained isolated from the outside world, not receiving unauthorized visits, and many did not know if they would see their children after giving birth. The births were meticulously documented, counting every phase. Some births were conducted without analgesia as a glorification of female suffering. After birth, the infant immediately underwent a racial assessment. Their physical characteristics were measured in detail, transforming them into statistical data within the eugenic project. Welcome rituals replaced Christian baptism with Germanic language ceremonies devised by Himmler, which included water from springs considered sacred, Nordic chants, and oaths to the Führer. Names of ancient German origin, such as Siegfried or Brunhilde, were given instead of Christian names. After birth, many mothers never saw their children again. The infants passed into the hands of the state. The babies were sent to special nurseries, institutions designated by the SS, or National Socialist Educational Facilities. Those who passed these filters began their ideological education from infancy: obedience, racial superiority, and German pride. Between 1936 and 1945, approximately 20,000 to 30,000 children were born under the Lebensborn program. Most were in Germany and Norway, although there were also births in Austria, Poland, France, and other occupied territories. The monastic regime daily life in a Lebensborn house followed an almost monastic regime, designed to create an atmosphere that combined elements of a hospital, an ideological school, and a closed community. The day began early with physical exercises specific to pregnant women, devised by SS doctors. These exercises, documented in internal manuals found after the war, aimed to strengthen the maternal body while instilling military discipline. The diet was meticulously planned according to particular racial principles. Preference was given to foods considered truly German: whole grain rye bread, milk, honey, pork, and root vegetables, while foreign or degenerate foods, such as coffee, exotic spices, or processed products, were avoided. The war rationing that severely affected the regular German population did not apply in these institutions, which received priority supplies directly from the SS. The internal architecture of the Lebensborn houses reflected a fusion of medical functionality and ideological symbolism. Irmgard Heinemann, a nurse who worked at the house in Bad Polzin, now Poland, and testified years later, described how the rooms combined modern hospital equipment with runic symbols, portraits of the Führer, and furniture inspired by Nordic aesthetics. Every detail, from the lighting to the arrangement of the beds, was designed to reinforce the idea of participating in a transcendental historical project. The constant presence of doctors, nurses, and administrative staff created an environment of permanent surveillance. Participants were constantly evaluated, not only in physical terms but also in ideological and psychological aspects. Detailed records were kept of their behavior, attitude, and comments. Those who showed doubts, criticism, or insufficient enthusiasm could be excluded from the program, or, in more serious cases, face disciplinary consequences. The psychological aspect of the Lebensborn project is less documented than its biological dimensions, but later testimonies reveal systematic methods of emotional manipulation. Women were simultaneously elevated as mothers of the nation while being denied basic autonomy. This contradiction of being indispensable yet expendable, honored yet controlled, generated a psychological dependence on the institution, making individual resistance difficult. Erna Becker-Cohen, one of the few participants to leave written testimony, found only in 1987, described the atmosphere as a gilded prison where we were treated as precious yet empty vessels. This description captures the fundamental duality of the program. It offered protection, food, and medical care during the war, but at the cost of transforming participants into passive components of a large-scale social experiment. Ideological education formed a central part of the daily routine. During pregnancy, women received classes on racial theory, German studies, Nordic mythology, and history, reinterpreted according to the National Socialist vision. These training seminars, led by female SS members or appointed instructors, were intended to ensure that the mothers, even if they did not raise their children, transmitted the correct worldview during the pregnancy. A distinctive feature of the Lebensborn program was the genetic screenings, which were pioneering for the time, although elementary by modern standards. They represented cutting-edge technology in the 1930s and 1940s. Blood types, hereditary characteristics, and genetic predispositions were analyzed using methods specifically developed by researchers linked to the program. This data was stored in biological archives to be used for future selective crossbreeding, testifying to the long-term vision of this eugenic project. The bureaucratic precision reached extraordinary levels concerning the newborns. Each child received an NST, a vital file, which included not only their physical characteristics, but also their racial potential, assessed according to pseudoscientific scales developed by the Russia. This documentation determined their immediate fate. Those deemed valuable or very valuable entered an elite adoption program. Those deemed acceptable remained in institutional nurseries. Those who generated doubts were progressively marginalized. The theft of innocence. Under the guise of social assistance that the Nazi propaganda apparatus created around Lebensborn, a system of structural violence operated, where the female body functioned as a resource serving the racial machinery. Women who entered the program voluntarily often did so under the influence of deception, social pressure, and economic necessity. Others, especially in the occupied territories, were forced to participate without valid consent, becoming victims of systematic rape by German officers. The program also carried out the mass kidnapping of children with physical characteristics considered racially valuable. One of the most disturbing aspects of Lebensborn was its ability to normalize rape as a political tool. In Germany, sexual relations within the program were presented as voluntary, but this classification ignores the coercive context. Women found themselves isolated from their surroundings, subjected to the absolute authority of the SS, and exposed to constant ideological pressure. In the occupied territories, such as Norway and France, the line between voluntary and forced relationships became even more blurred. Thousands of women were pressured by German soldiers to engage in sexual relations in exchange for protection, food, or privileges in a context of military occupation. In Poland, where resistance to the German occupation was intense, the program led to the brutal appropriation of the female body. Young women were captured, racially assessed, and held for forced conception. These rapes were not acts of individual cruelty, but a state policy aimed at creating Aryan offspring in territories that the Reich planned to biologically colonize. Internal SS documentation described pregnancy as a biological function of national significance, turning women into instruments whose will was irrelevant. Refusal to participate could entail serious reprisals, the loss of food rations, physical violence, deportation, or internment in concentration camps. From 1941, under direct orders from Himmler, the SS initiated an operation to identify, kidnap, and Germanize children who met the Nazi racial criteria. Lebensborn officials deployed specialized groups in schools, orphanages, and rural communities to select children with Nordic features. These children were separated from their families without explanation or judicial process. Many were ripped from their parents' arms at train stations or during nighttime raids. Those who passed the racial tests were sent to Germany, where they received a new identity, a German name, a fictitious German nationality, and placement in Lebensborn houses or foster families. There, they learned the German language. They were forbidden to speak their native language and received intensive National Socialist ideological education. Children who did not pass the racial assessments or actively resisted Germanization faced tragic fates. Many were interned in children's concentration camps, such as the one in Worth, Litzmannstadt, where they were subjected to medical experiments, forced labor, or extermination through fatal injections or starvation. It is estimated that at least 200,000 children were kidnapped in Poland alone, although this figure may be higher. Minors were also captured in Czechoslovakia, Slovenia, Ukraine, and other occupied territories. The kidnapping of children constituted the murder of an identity. The Germanized children lost their language, family history, culture, and origins. Many grew up without knowing their true nationality. Germanization involved a systematic process of ideological reprogramming that began with the change of name and continued with the total suppression of memories through physical and psychological punishments. Vera Granic, a Polish girl kidnapped at 5 and raised in Germany under a different name, only understood after the war that her real parents had perished in Treblinka. "My childhood was a lie," she stated years later. "My language, my memory, my mother were taken from me." The Program for the Recovery of Valuable Blood, the euphemistic term used in official documents to refer to the kidnapping of children, operated through a complex network of interconnected institutions. The process began with the Rassenprüfer racial experts, officials with anthropological training, who traveled through the occupied territories, especially the rural areas of Poland and Ukraine, where, according to Nazi racial theories, descendants of ancient German settlements with unblemished Nordic blood could be found. These experts applied a scrupulous classification developed by Professor Eugen Fischer of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology. The scale included 62 measurable physical characteristics, from the angle of the face to the shape of the nose. Measuring earlobes was one part of a complex scoring system. Evaluated children received grades from 1 to 11. Scores from 1 to 4 meant racially valuable, 5 to 6 was acceptable, and 7 to 11 indicated racially undesirable. The selections and abductions testimonies from the Nuremberg trials documented that these evaluations took only a few minutes per child. They were often conducted in local schools using intimidating methods. Maria Hanfova, a Czech teacher from the rural school in Blizlidice village, notorious for its destruction in retaliation for the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, documented how this process functioned. They arrived without warning one January morning, 1943. 3 uniformed men and a woman in a white coat. They ordered all the children to line up in the courtyard. They took measurements, photographs, and hair samples. 2 weeks later, 11 children disappeared. Their families received official letters stating that they were selected for special education. The abducted children initially passed through repollinization centers known as Eindeutschungslager, like those in Varta or Kalisz. Any trace of their original identity was systematically eliminated there. Survivor testimonies, such as Roman Wlazek's, recorded by the Polish Historical Commission in 1947, described these institutions. "We were forced to stay awake in front of posters with German phrases until we memorized them," he recounted. "Anyone who spoke Polish was beaten. After 3 months, we didn't recognize our own brothers. We were turned into strangers." The fate of identical twins was particularly tragic. They were highly valued in Nazi eugenics programs under Dr. Josef Mengele at Auschwitz, but also had documented connections to the Lebensborn program. Numerous pairs of twins with valuable racial characteristics were deliberately separated. One was sent for medical experiments, and the other to German families as part of nature versus nurture studies. This separation, documented by researchers like Dr. Yehuda Bauer, illustrates the regime's extreme instrumentalization of childhood. The logic of genocide. Ulrich Greifeld, a high-ranking Russia officer later tried at Nuremberg, admitted in an internal memorandum dated September 1942, found in Soviet archives, that the displacement of children served the cause doubly. "It eliminates the enemy's future reproductive potential," he wrote, while simultaneously strengthening our own demographic base. This quote reveals the underlying logic. The kidnapping of children was not merely forced adoption, it was a deliberate strategy of long-term demographic genocide. Sexual violence and biopolicy. Sexual violence as a biopolitical weapon reached particularly alarming dimensions in the occupied eastern territories. In zones designated as German settlement areas, mainly western Poland and parts of Ukraine, special units combined sexual violence with racial selection. According to a testimony documented by Polish historian Czesław Madejczyk, there were facilities, such as the one in Chełmionka, where young Slavic women with suitable racial characteristics were systematically violated by selected officers. Pregnant women were transferred to Lebensborn homes if the future child was deemed racially valuable. Otherwise, they were sent to labor camps. Hormonal and financial dimensions. Hormonal experiments constituted another lesser documented aspect of the program. In some Lebensborn facilities, particularly Pernitz, Austria, SS doctors like Walter Stoliker conducted hormone courses to increase fertility, accelerate physical development in children, or even attempt to influence the sex of future babies. These experiments, documented fragmentarily in archives captured by the Soviet Army and only partially declassified in the 1990s, demonstrate the extent to which the program combined demographic policy with unethical biomedical research. The appropriation of children had a telling economic dimension. According to recovered administrative records, German families adopting Germanized children had to pay between 750 and 1,500 Reichmarks to the Lebensborn administration. This commercialization of stolen children brought significant revenue to the program. It effectively created an adoption market based on racial criteria, where Nordic features determined the price. Biological conquest of Europe. The Lebensborn program, originating on German soil, soon extended beyond the Reich, becoming an instrument of biological colonization across Europe. As the German army advanced, the Nazi ideological apparatus turned every conquered territory into a demographic resource to be exploited according to racial criteria. Himmler conceived the expansion of Lebensborn as a way to remap the human composition of Europe. Norway, Belgium, France, Holland, and Austria became key arenas for this unprecedented operation. Austria was the first territory incorporated into Lebensborn after the Anschluss in 1938. Since it was considered an integral part of Greater Germany, the establishment of Lebensborn homes required no additional legal justification. Spiegelgrund. Castle on the outskirts of Vienna was turned into a key facility. While officially functioning as a children's hospital, its premises housed medical experiments, hidden euthanasias, and racial classifications. Thousands of Austrian women were recruited, while children who did not meet racial standards were destroyed or sent to re-education facilities. Norway arguably represents the most characteristic case of Lebensborn expansion. With its population exhibiting prominent Nordic features, the Scandinavian country was identified by Himmler as the ideal territory for German genetic expansion. After the occupation in 1940, the program established maternity homes and adoption facilities in Voss, Bergen, and Trondheim. More than 12,000 children were born from relationships between Norwegian women and German soldiers during the occupation. If they met the racial requirements, many were sent to Germany for complete Germanization. In France, Lebensborn took seemingly more subtle forms. Paris and other major cities became the scene of organized seduction operations. German officers received instructions to establish relationships with local women possessing desirable racial characteristics. Secret clinics were established in regions with a historically significant Germanic presence, such as Alsace-Lorraine. From there, children were transported to Germany for racial evaluation and subsequent placement with selected families. This process involved document forgery, Germanizing surnames, and creating entirely fictitious biographies. In Belgium and the Netherlands, Lebensborn operated with less institutional visibility, but with intense ideological activity. In the Netherlands, where collaboration was more widespread, about 5,000 connections between Dutch women and German soldiers were registered. On Belgian territory, where the occupation was more brutal, child abductions were more frequent. Lebensborn teams worked in hospitals, churches, and orphanages, identifying fair-haired or light-eyed children who could pass as German. In all these countries, the Germanization process followed a systematic protocol: racial identification through medical examination, separation from the family, identity alteration with new names, surnames, and German citizenship. It culminated in re-education in National Socialist schools, with punishments for using the native tongue, and finally adoption by German families with no possibility of contact with their past. Aftermath and impunity. The defeat of Germany in 1945 led to the collapse of the Lebensborn system. However, the victims, especially the Germanized children in occupied countries, found themselves in a legal and emotional limbo. Numerous adoptive families refused to return the children, and the program's archives were partially destroyed by the SS to avoid legal accountability. Most of these children grew up without knowing their true identity. In Norway, France, and Belgium, the Lebensborn children faced constant social rejection. They were perceived as children of the enemy and a product of national humiliation. Some ended up in psychiatric institutions, others in correctional orphanages. Systematic investigations of these facts, initiated by historians, human rights organizations, and victim associations, only began in the 1990s. Some countries, such as Norway, offered public apologies. In others, like France, the topic remains partially taboo in official historical memory. The Norwegian case. The implementation of Lebensborn in Norway had specific characteristics, illustrating the program's strategic adaptation to local conditions. After the invasion in April 1940, Reichskommissar Josef Terboven and collaborationist Vidkun Quisling created a regulatory framework that facilitated relationships between German soldiers and Norwegian women. The Direktiv über deutsch-norwegische Beziehungen, issued in August 1940, explicitly stated, relationships between German soldiers and Norwegian women must be encouraged as a contribution to the Nordic unification. The Lebensborn home in Godthåb on the outskirts of Oslo was the first opened outside German territory. Located in a former aristocratic mansion, this facility catered exclusively to Norwegian women pregnant by German soldiers. According to documentation recovered from the Riksarkivet, the Norwegian National Archives, this home received special direct funding from Himmler's office. This shows the strategic importance the regime placed on the reconstitution of Nordic blood. A distinctive feature of the Norwegian case was the creation of a special administrative structure, the Lebensborn section Teilobjekt Lebensborn, directly subordinated to the German commissioner. This hybrid structure allowed for more effective social penetration, using local networks and knowledge of the terrain to identify potential participants. Günther Schwab, the chief administrator of this section, wrote in an internal report in 1942, "Norway represents our most fertile field. Here, the German blood has been preserved more purely than in Germany itself." Internal statistical reports indicate that approximately 40% of Norwegian participants joined the program for immediate economic reasons. 30% did so because of social pressure or effective propaganda, and only 20% were driven by ideological conviction. The remaining 10% joined through varying degrees of direct coercion. This demographic composition partly explains why, After the war, Norwegian society displayed particular harshness toward these women. They were perceived as opportunists or traitors, not as victims. The French case. The French cases represent a very different implementation, mainly due to two factors: more intense French cultural resistance and the Nazi racial perception, which considered the French partially acceptable, but not racially optimal. Program documents show that in France, Lebensborn operated with greater secrecy, disguising its facilities as private clinics or rest homes seemingly unconnected to the German administration. The Château de Montgrief, near Moulins, acted as the main Lebensborn facility in France. Recovered archives show that, unlike other homes, it applied an extremely strict selection process. Only women with proven Germanic ancestry, mainly Alsatians or descendants of historical migrations, were accepted. Other French women pregnant by German soldiers received temporary assistance, but their children rarely entered the selective adoption program. Eastern Europe. The implementation of Lebensborn in the Netherlands was linked to the active local collaborationist movement. The National Socialist movement of the Netherlands actively participated in recruiting women for the program, presenting it as a biological bridge between the Germanic peoples. Propagandistic brochures distributed in 1942 and preserved in the National Archives of the Netherlands showcase this rhetoric. A Dutch mother giving a child to a German soldier builds the future of Europe. A lesser-known but strategically important aspect was the use of Lebensborn as a diplomatic tool in formerly allied but non-occupied countries. In Sweden, a neutral country during the war, the program's secret agents operated, identifying Swedish women willing to participate. These women voluntarily traveled to Lebensborn homes in Norway or Germany. Swedish diplomatic documentation, declassified in 2001, shows that the Swedish government knew about this activity, but tolerated it to preserve its neutrality in trade relations with Germany. In Denmark, the program's implementation followed a soft model due to the country's peculiar political situation occupied, but with administrative autonomy, until 1943. The main home in Copenhagen, called the German-Danish Center for Mother and Child Welfare, operated under the guise of a joint initiative. Recent research by Danish historian Per Høj Sørensen documents that approximately 6,000 children were born from relationships between Danish women and Germans, many under the program's indirect supervision. The expansion of Lebensborn into Eastern Europe followed more aggressive models, directly linked to ethnic cleansing policies. In territories like Slovenia, partially incorporated into the Reich as the province of Ljubljana, Lebensborn operated as a direct complement to mass deportations. Administrative documents recovered from the German Federal Archives show a correlation. Areas where the Slavic population was deported or exterminated were immediately settled by racial colonists, including Lebensborn facilities for the biological Germanization of the territory. Resistance and collapse. Local resistance to the program took various forms depending on the national context. In Norway, the Lutheran Church played a central role, publicly speaking out against the program through pastoral letters that condemned it as an assault on the Christian family. In France, underground adoption networks linked to the resistance tried to intercept children destined for German Lebensborn homes. In Poland, the resistance's destruction of civil records complicated the racial identification of children. Underground instructions were circulated for families to artificially darken fair-haired children with natural dyes to prevent their abduction. Each national manifestation of the Lebensborn program adapted its methods to local conditions, but the ideological core remained constant: biological colonization as a natural extension of military occupation. In early 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled militarily and morally, the Lebensborn program entered its final phase. The SS High Command ordered the destruction of all documentation related to the program: birth certificates, medical records, genealogical archives, and adoption lists. The priority was evident. They needed to erase the traces of the regime's most infamous human experiment. Those responsible understood that the world would soon discover that a systematic policy of rape, abduction, medical experimentation, and child manipulation on a continental scale was hidden beneath a facade of social aid. In April 1945, as Allied forces liberated German and Austrian cities, the physical traces of Lebensborn appeared. What they found were not concentration camps, but elegant mansions, refined gynecological clinics, partially burned archives, and abandoned maternity wards. In many facilities, children remained, held without documents, without an identifiable family, and without knowledge of their own identity. In places like Steinhöring or Wienerwald, soldiers found impeccable nurseries, perfectly aligned cribs, portraits of Hitler on the walls, and guides to National Socialist education. The most striking presence was that of the unidentified children, marked with numbers or artificially Germanized surnames. Nuremberg's failure. The SS had learned from the regime's other failures. Where there was documentation of horror, there was the possibility of prosecution. Therefore, a massive process of archival destruction and elimination of Lebensborn evidence was carried out in the last months of the war. Radical methods were employed. Some homes were dynamited, others set on fire. Many clinics were completely dismantled. This deliberate action, planned from Berlin, resulted in approximately 70% of the program's official archives disappearing forever. The situation was exacerbated by the division of territories among the Allied powers, which did not exchange all the information they obtained. The Soviet Union confiscated Lebensborn archives in Austria and Czechoslovakia, which were never fully declassified. France partially concealed its involvement in the program. The Nuremberg trials, held in 1945 and 1946, represented the most ambitious attempt to prosecute the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by a modern state. However, the Lebensborn program received only minor and superficial consideration in these trials. In the so-called Russia case, the trial of the SS Main Office for Race and Settlement, several officers involved in racial policy, including Lebensborn members, were brought to trial. Yet the main focus was on the forced displacement of populations, not on reproductive abuses or the systematic abduction of children. Gregor Ebner, the chief physician of Lebensborn, admitted his direct involvement in managing multiple maternity homes. However, he claimed that his work was exclusively medical and humanitarian, denying knowledge of rapes or child abductions. Astonishingly, the court acquitted him of criminal liability. Other defendants used similar arguments, claiming that Lebensborn was a charitable initiative. The absence of the previously destroyed official documents severely hampered the prosecution's work. Without compelling documentary evidence, the judges dismissed numerous charges related to the program. Ultimately, none of the Lebensborn leaders were convicted of crimes against humanity specifically related to this program. The impunity of the main perpetrators was not solely a result of insufficient evidence. It also reflected the political context of the beginning of the Cold War. The Allied powers, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, prioritized access to German scientists, espionage information, and institutional recovery, postponing many trials deemed secondary. The acquittal of the main people responsible for Lebensborn became a betrayal of the victims, the raped mothers, the stolen children, and the women forced to give birth for a regime that later discarded them as expendable biological material. The discovery of the Lebensborn homes by Allied troops occurred mainly by chance. American Captain Thomas Royal, whose unit discovered the home in Steinhöring on May 2, 1945, left a written testimony of the initial bewilderment. "We expected to find a military installation, perhaps officers' barracks," he wrote. "Instead, we found dozens of women in nurses' uniforms caring for small children. No one spoke. Everyone seemed terrified. Half-burned documents partially revealed the truth to us." The situation at the eastern Lebensborn facilities, liberated by the Soviet forces, was similar. The thought has naturally come to rest. The military operation against the Lebensborn centers had its own distinct character. According to documents from the Russian Military Archive, declassified in 2015, Red Army troops had specific orders. They were to search for and secure the Lebensborn centers, which they considered German intelligence facilities. Commander Ivan Polyakov, responsible for locating the house in Korenzalis, Saxony, reported his findings. The German staff had been evacuated, but they left behind 38 children. They also left partially intact files that revealed Polish, Czech, and Ukrainian origins. The process of destroying the documentation followed organized patterns. This demonstrated centralized planning. A memorandum signed by Oswald Pohl, head of the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office, dated the 18th of January 1945, prescribed a clear action. All sensitive materials of a racial biological category had to be destroyed through complete burning. General medical records could be evacuated. Importantly, no documents marked Geheim, or secret, or above, were to fall into enemy hands. This order, which was recovered from the British military archives, confirms the Nazi administration's awareness of its guilt. the method of destruction varied significantly. In West Germany, where the evacuation was relatively orderly, industrial incinerators were mainly used. In the Eastern territories, where the Soviet advance was swifter, destruction by explosives or direct fire was chosen. This was often less effective. This difference partly explains why more documentation survived in areas occupied by Soviet forces. The fate of the physical properties themselves differed after their discovery. Some, like the main house in Steinhöring, were repurposed as Allied military hospitals. Others, especially in the rural domains of Austria and East Germany, became reception centers for refugees and displaced persons. It is ironic that several buildings that once served programs of racial purity ultimately housed the very people the regime sought to eliminate. The immediate fate of the children found at these centers largely depended on the occupation zone. In the western sectors, American, British, and French, the military authorities developed protocols for the identification and repatriation of kidnapped children. Special commissions were created, such as the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA. This body developed innovative methods to determine origin, including linguistic tests to detect native accents. Under the German occupation regime in the Soviet zone, the approach was noticeably different. Documents from the Russian Ministry of Defense indicate that many children found in the Lebensborn homes were transferred to Soviet orphanages. This happened without significant attempts at repatriation. They were effectively treated as war trophies. The historian Pavel Polyan documented how some children from the Baltic states and Poland grew up as Soviet citizens, never learning their true origins. The judicial process, the race case, case number 8 of the Nuremberg trials, represents the most formal attempt to hold accountable those responsible for implementing the program. This trial, which ran from October 1947 to March 1948, included 14 defendants linked to Nazi racial policy. This group included Ulrich Greifeld, Richard Hildebrandt, and Otto Hoffmann, all central administrators of the Lebensborn system. However, as Telford Taylor, the chief U.S. prosecutor, noted in his memoirs, the Lebensborn matter dissolved within the framework of the race case. It lost the specificity and persuasiveness of its evidence. The defense strategy of the accused, according to trial transcripts, showed deliberate schemes. They carefully separated the program's charitable aspects, medical aid, financial support, from its criminal actions, kidnapping, rape, and experiments. This fragmentation of the defense, combined with insufficient documentation, proved surprisingly effective. Out of the 14 defendants, only 10 received sentences. These were relatively mild terms, ranging from 10 to 25 years, which were later reduced by amnesties during the height of the Cold War. The French prosecutor Marcel Floriat, who attended these processes, expressed a twisted irony about the Lebensborn case in private correspondence declassified in 1985. Its outward appearance of social welfare proved effective even in court. When we showed photos of the Lebensborn homes with clean facilities and well-cared-for infants, it was difficult to convey the underlying horror. This included the stolen children or the destroyed identities. Abstract suffering proved legally elusive. The acquittal of Gregor Ebner, perhaps the most well-known physician in the program, illustrates this difficulty of proof. Despite the fact that Ebner personally signed directives on the racial classification of children, he convinced the court that his activities were purely medical. After his release, he ran a private pediatric practice in Munich until 1966. This is a telling example of the professional continuity of many surviving criminals. The silent journey of the Lebensborn children began when the war ended and Europe began to rebuild. While concentration camps were being liberated and Nazi leaders were being tried, one group of people remained completely ignored: the Lebensborn children. These children did not know they had been selected based on racial criteria, torn from their original families, or raised as part of an ideological machine. The children, born or kidnapped according to the Reich's racial standards, faced a conflict longer than the war. They fought to recover their identity, understand their origins, and survive under an imposed stigma. While the world celebrated victory over Nazism, they remained the biological remnants of a monstrous experiment. Many were found in abandoned maternity wards or SS boarding schools, completely stripped of documents or family ties. Some fell under the temporary care of Allied forces. Others were transferred to state orphanages or given to foster families with no information about their origins. In Germany, these children were classified as war orphans, concealing their specific connection to the racial program. Often foster families were unaware of the child's past. Children who asked questions about their origins received evasive answers or were punished for their curiosity. The situation proved especially traumatic in countries like Norway and France. There, Lebensborn children were perceived as living symbols of the German occupation. The mere suspicion of a Nazi origin was enough to provoke marginalization, physical attacks, or institutionalization. Authorities changed names, sealed archives, and rewrote entire family histories. Depersonalization became a standard mechanism of social control. These children were systematically deprived of the most basic human right, to know their own identity. A Norwegian government study, published in 2002, showed that hundreds of Lebensborn children were institutionalized for purely ideological reasons. This happened without valid clinical diagnoses. They were placed in centers where they suffered inhumane treatment. This included electroconvulsive therapy, prolonged isolation, and corporal punishment. Among the documented cases, Annie Frid Lyngstad stands out. She was the daughter of a German officer and a young Norwegian woman. After the war, her mother faced social marginalization and died prematurely. Annie Frid was sent to Sweden to avoid repression, and decades later gained recognition as a member of the group ABBA. Her biography reflects a childhood marked by social rejection and historical silence. In the 1980s and 90s, a generation of adult Lebensborn children began to publicly claim their identity. This was driven by social transformations and access to new documentary resources. They undertook personal searches to uncover their hidden past. This journey often represented a psychological and bureaucratic ordeal. Without reliable documents, direct testimony, or institutional support, rebuilding an original identity became an almost insoluble emotional puzzle. Some turned to specialized journalists, historians, or private detectives. Others used genetic tests and international search networks to trace family roots. For many, the truth came late and with a traumatic effect. They discovered the deaths of biological parents, the rape of their mothers, or violent harmonization as the reason for their adoption. The emotional impact caused deep identity crises, severe depression, and family ruptures with adoptive parents who had concealed the truth for decades. The damage caused by the Lebensborn program extended beyond those born directly under its structure. Its consequences spread through generations to descendants, partners, and the social environment. Many children of the program developed unrecognized trauma. This included difficulties in forming stable attachments, a pathological fear of abandonment, anxiety of belonging, and an existential shame without visible cause. Studies in intergenerational psychology show that unresolved childhood traumas can be transmitted emotionally and epigenetically to subsequent generations. Grandchildren of people born in Lebensborn homes reported a feeling of carrying foreign histories and living in an unconscious shadow. Starting in 2000, surviving participants of the Lebensborn program began creating transnational organizations. They demanded official recognition, psychological support, access to archives, and historical justice. In Norway, this mobilization led to partial results. In 2002, the government issued an official apology and established limited financial compensation for some victims. In Germany, the process was slower. Only in 2006 was an official program created to facilitate access to Lebensborn documentation, although many archives remain inaccessible. The struggle continues in courts and public spaces for comprehensive recognition. Survivors demand more than just financial compensation. They seek memorial recognition. They aim for the Lebensborn story to be included in school curricula, Holocaust museums, and mass media. Their goal is for their experiences, silenced for decades, to occupy their rightful place in the historical narrative of the Third Reich's crimes. The Norwegian cases particularly illustrate the systematic stigmatization of these children. Volker Eitan, born in 1942 in the Lebensborn home in Gatehube, and the son of a German officer, documented his experience in his autobiography, Enemy's Child, 1998. He showed how the Norwegian education system actively participated in this discrimination. Teachers allowed, even encouraged, them to be isolated during breaks. They were called little Nazis, or German bastards. During history lessons about the occupation, all eyes were on them, as if they were personally guilty. Research by the Norwegian historian Lars Bergers-Ruud showed that approximately 30% of Norwegian Lebensborn children were placed in psychiatric institutions between 1945 and 1960 without medical justification. The Gaustad Psychiatric Hospital near Oslo had a special unit, euphemistically called the Department for Children with War Disorders. Here, punitive treatments were applied. This included cold hydrotherapy, prolonged isolation, and sometimes lobotomy in cases of persistent disobedience. Identity dissociation characterized many survivors. Harriet von Nickel, born in the Lebensborn house in Joachimsdorf, Germany, and subsequently transferred to Norway, described her experience in an interview for the documentary Hitler's Perfect Children, 2000. She developed two parallel personalities. Externally, she was Harriet, the obedient Norwegian girl who tried to remain unnoticed. Internally, she remained Greta, a name she vaguely remembered from her early years. She spoke to herself in an invented language that mixed fragmented German words with Norwegian constructions. The phenomenon of double orphanhood especially affected children kidnapped from Eastern countries. Alexei Trokimiuk, a Polish child who was Germanized and renamed Alfred Hartmann, documented in his memoirs, A Stolen Life, 1997, how he faced new rejection after returning to Poland in 1947. In Germany, he was an unwanted Pole. In Poland, he became a hated German. He had forgotten his native language, and his accent betrayed him. His biological family, when he finally found them, was a group of strangers. They expected the small Alexei, but received a Germanized teenager. In France, the situation took on peculiar dimensions due to intense institutional collaborationism. Daniel Roussel, the son of a German soldier and a French mother, and founder of the Association for Children of German Soldiers, Amicale Nationale des Enfants de Doudous, described in court testimony how the French state actively participated in the concealment. When he requested his birth certificates in 1965, he found contradictory versions. In some, he appeared as a war orphan, in others, as the son of an unknown father. Only in 1990, after decades of investigation, did he find his original certificate. This document clearly stated his father's identity as a Wehrmacht sergeant.